Hello again, I'm Dave Lucas, your learning engineer for communicating with people with disabilities. We're looking at Module 4 today, and I wanted to discuss with you a little bit about the idea of the ethics of dignity. Now, in the previous modules and in the preliminary module, we talked a little bit about how important it is for us to practice good ethics in communication overall. And this has become a concern on college campuses for the idea of never involving yourself in plagiarism, for example, by stealing someone's material and using it as your own. That's one of the reasons I like doing these videos, because I don't want you, the student, to think that I'm just using all this other material from other people. Yet there are a lot of experts out there that it's okay for us to use as long as we give them credit. So the idea of plagiarism is stealing somebody's material and taking credit for yourself. It's always good to give people credit where credit is due. But there's a new fold in the idea of ethics when we're talking about dealing with people with disabilities, because they can be taken advantage of. Often they are in circumstances or situations where they can be manipulated. And those of us who are communicators need to be careful that we exercise good ethics throughout everything we do when it comes in terms of communicating with these people. Before we get into a little bit of the material that I have for you today, I want to make sure you read chapters 8 and 9 in your textbook for this module, and then review all the material and involve yourself in the discussion board, and make sure you stay up with all this. It's easy to get distracted and easy to get behind, and once that happens, it's hard to stay up. So we're in Module 4, and so it could be that you'd be getting behind now, so don't let that happen. Let's talk for a moment about the kinds of disabilities that are out there. Persons who are blind, visually impaired, people with cerebral palsy, some who have communication disorders, speech disorders, and speech impairments. That's always difficult. And we said, again, the ethical thing to do is to say to the person, I'm sorry, I just don't understand you, but maybe you could write it down. There are people who are without hearing, deaf, hard of hearing. Some people have a developmental disability where from childhood they've not been able to develop like others around them. Epilepsy, paraplegics, people whose legs and arms either do not work or have, we've had a lot of these accidents in the combat zones where people's limbs have been ripped apart. Psychiatric disabilities, seizure disorders, people who have various seizures that they deal with in their lives, and wheelchair users. We've talked about all these. And so what we're doing in this class and in this module especially is looking at the idea of how that we have an ethical responsibility to treat people with fairness, dignity, and honor, not to mistreat people who may not have the same capabilities as do we. As a boy, I remember I had a friend whose name was Robert who walked on crutches. The kinds of crutches that wrap around your arm and that you hold in your hands. I'm sure you've seen those before. Not just the wooden ones that go up underneath your armpits, but those that wrap around your bicep. And he was a victim of polio. Had braces on his legs. In our little community, most people treated him with kindness and respect. I remember, however, in the 5th grade we had a bus driver who either needed an attitude adjustment like we talked about earlier, or just needed to get a life because he had a bad attitude. He yelled at students all the time. I know these people get nervous driving bus. It has to be a horrendous job. But he screamed at people, had little patience for any young person. Why he drove a bus, I'll never understand, other than maybe he just needed the money. But when Robert would try to get on the bus, this man would get so angry. And I remember one day, he grabbed those crutches from Robert and threw them up on the bus, and then lifted Robert up. He could do it. He was a big man, and shoved him up on the bus Today, they would have him in jail. But in those days, it was all up to him how he treated us, what he did to the students, and how he talked to them. Nobody came to Robert's rescue. We were all little, young people. And yet, I remember at that very moment thinking to myself, that's unfair. That's mean. This guy, he needs somebody to correct him. Of course, if I were to see something like that now, I would report it immediately. No one else saw it but the children, those of us who were riding the bus. But I'll never forget what Robert said when he finally sat down. I was sitting with him on the bus. He said, you know, this guy needs converted. I think Robert and his family were faithful churchgoers, and he just developed that as the resolution to the problem. But maybe Robert was right, not necessarily in a religious connotation. That's not what we're doing here, is preaching at you. But maybe that bus driver didn't need a conversion. Maybe this course of learning that each of us have an ethical and just, in a way, a spiritual responsibility to treat people with dignity and honor and care, but more especially people with disability. So as you go about the practice this week of involving yourself in this module, think about your ethical responsibilities in communication and communicating with people with disabilities.